Sergeant Thomas Mackenzie stood in the crowded streets of Saigon in February 1967 and experienced something he had never anticipated encountering during a combat deployment. He was being pursued by approximately 15 Vietnamese women who had apparently decided that his presence on the street was the most interesting thing that had occurred in their day. The pursuit was not aggressive, it was insistent. The women ranged in age from early 20s to early 40s. Some were street vendors. Some appeared to be refugees. Some simply appeared to be civilians going about their daily lives who had encountered Australian soldiers and decided that encountering Australian soldiers was worth interrupting whatever they had been doing. Mackenzie and his fellow soldiers attempted to move through the crowded market street to reach their transportation. The women followed, calling out to the soldiers in Vietnamese and in broken English. When the soldiers did not respond, the women became more insistent, physically positioning themselves to prevent the soldiers from moving forward. One woman, apparently in her late 20s, positioned herself directly in front of Mackenzie. She looked up at him with what could only be described as frank assessment. She said something in Vietnamese to her companions, who laughed in response. Mackenzie did not understand Vietnamese, but the tone of the conversation suggested that he was the subject of discussion, and that the discussion was favorable. Eventually, Mackenzie and his fellow soldiers managed to extricate themselves from the crowd of women and reach their transportation. The soldiers departed the market area, leaving behind a group of visibly disappointed Vietnamese women. When Mackenzie returned to his unit and described the incident to other soldiers, he discovered that he was not alone in having encountered this phenomenon. Multiple soldiers reported similar experiences. When Australian soldiers were in public spaces in Saigon, Vietnamese women tended to take notice. The notice was not subtle. By mid-1967, the phenomenon had become regular enough that Australian soldiers could describe it with something approaching clinical detachment. When Australian soldiers went into Saigon, Vietnamese women would approach. The women would attempt conversations. The women would attempt to touch the soldiers' arms or shoulders. The women would attempt to arrange meetings. The phenomenon was particularly pronounced when Australian soldiers were in groups or when they were in public spaces where their physical appearance was visible. Australian soldiers in uniform, with their characteristic physiques developed through jungle training, stood out in the crowds of Vietnamese civilians. This visibility, combined with the specific nature of the Australian physique, created an effect that military observers came to call the Saigon effect. Vietnamese women were disproportionately attracted to Australian soldiers compared to American soldiers, even though American soldiers outnumbered Australian soldiers by a factor of perhaps 50 to 1. Military sociologists and observers of the Vietnam War phenomenon began examining the Saigon effect to understand why it was occurring. The explanation was not simple. Multiple factors appeared to be contributing. First, there was novelty. Australian soldiers were less common than American soldiers. There were fewer of them. Vietnamese women who had minimal contact with Australian soldiers might find the encounter with an Australian soldier to be noteworthy simply because of its rarity. Second, there was physical appearance. Australian soldiers, on average, possessed more impressive physiques than American soldiers. The training methodology that Australian soldiers underwent developed the kind of lean muscularity that many Vietnamese women appeared to find attractive. Third, there was behavior. Australian soldiers, whether intentionally or not, seemed to engage with Vietnamese civilians differently than American soldiers did. American soldiers often seemed to view interaction with Vietnamese civilians as transactional or as military necessities. Australian soldiers seemed more inclined to treat interactions as genuine human encounters. A military observer named Dr. Samuel Richardson conducted a sociological study of the Saigon effect in 1968. Richardson spent weeks observing Australian and American soldiers interacting with Vietnamese civilians in Saigon. Richardson interviewed Vietnamese women about their perceptions of Australian and American soldiers. Richardson's findings were striking. Vietnamese women overwhelmingly expressed greater attraction to Australian soldiers than to American soldiers. When asked why, Vietnamese women cited multiple reasons. Australian soldiers were perceived as more respectful. Australian soldiers were perceived as more physically attractive. Australian soldiers were perceived as more interested in genuine human interaction rather than in transactional relationships. One Vietnamese woman, a street vendor named Lin, who was in her early 30s, was direct in her assessment. American soldiers come to buy things. They are not interested in talking. They are not interested in knowing who you are. Australian soldiers, they talk. They ask questions. They seem interested in you as a person. Another woman, a refugee from North Vietnam named Min, who was in her early 20s, was more direct about the physical attraction component. Australian soldiers have better bodies. They are stronger. They look like soldiers should look. American soldiers, many of them do not look as strong. Richardson's study documented that the Saigon effect was based on a combination of factors, with physical appearance and behavioral differences being the most significant contributors. The study created some controversy within American military circles. The implication was that American soldiers were less physically attractive and less skilled at interpersonal interaction than Australian soldiers. This implication was not entirely welcome to American military leadership. But the phenomenon itself was undeniable. Vietnamese women were disproportionately attracted to Australian soldiers. The attraction was visible in public spaces throughout Saigon. The attraction was documented by multiple observers. By late 1967, the Saigon effect had become something of a joke within American military circles. American soldiers would make self-deprecating comments about how Australian soldiers seemed to attract Vietnamese women, while American soldiers did not. The jokes were made with humor, but also with a certain amount of genuine resentment. Some American military personnel began to attribute the Saigon effect to unfair advantages possessed by Australian soldiers. Some suggested that Australian soldiers were deliberately behaving in ways designed to attract Vietnamese women. Some suggested that the physical appearance advantage was somehow unfair or undeserved. But the reality was simpler. Australian soldiers were more physically fit than average American soldiers. Australian soldiers approached interpersonal interaction differently than American soldiers. Vietnamese women found the combination of physical attractiveness and respectful interpersonal engagement to be appealing. The result was the Vietnamese women were attracted to Australian soldiers. This simple reality created complications for American military leadership. The American military was supposed to be the superior military force in Vietnam. The American military had superior numbers, superior firepower, superior resources. But apparently, Australian soldiers were more physically attractive and more skilled at interpersonal interaction. The American military's response was to largely ignore the phenomenon. The Saigon effect was not addressed in official military communications or doctrine. It was not treated as a legitimate military concern. But the phenomenon was observed and discussed within military circles. And the observation contributed to a broader understanding that Australian soldiers possessed certain advantages over American soldiers in ways that American military leadership did not want to acknowledge. By 1968, the Saigon effect had become sufficiently well known that it was influencing how Vietnamese civilians perceived and interacted with Australian soldiers. Vietnamese women would specifically seek out Australian soldiers. Vietnamese families would apparently encourage their daughters or sisters to interact with Australian soldiers. This phenomenon created opportunities for Australian soldiers that were not always available to American soldiers. Vietnamese women would offer assistance to Australian soldiers. Vietnamese women would provide information or hospitality to Australian soldiers. Vietnamese women would establish relationships with Australian soldiers. In some cases, these relationships were romantic or sexual in nature. In some cases, they were based on the Vietnamese women's perception that association with Australian soldiers provided some form of protection or benefit. The phenomenon was not unique to Vietnam. The presence of foreign military forces in any location tends to create attraction and interaction with local women. But the scale and the visibility of the Saigon effect in Vietnam was remarkable. By 1969, when the Australian military presence in Vietnam was beginning to wind down, the Saigon effect had become an established part of the folklore of the Vietnam War. It was understood that Australian soldiers, for whatever combination of reasons, were disproportionately attractive to Vietnamese women. Australian soldiers themselves had mixed feelings about the phenomenon. Some found it flattering. Some found it uncomfortable or problematic. Some viewed it with humor and treated it as an amusing aspect of military life in Vietnam. One Australian soldier named Peter Carlson described the phenomenon in an interview years later. "It was strange," he said. "You would be walking through Saigon, and suddenly Vietnamese women would be following you or approaching you. They would smile at you. They would try to talk to you. It was flattering at first, but it became strange when you understood that the attraction was based on something as superficial as physical appearance and the fact that you were Australian rather than American." The phenomenon also created social complications. Vietnamese women who became involved with Australian soldiers faced potential ostracism or danger from various factions in Saigon. Some families disapproved of their daughters or sisters associating with foreign soldiers. Some political factions viewed such associations as collaborationist. But despite these complications, the relationships continued to form. Vietnamese women continued to be attracted to Australian soldiers. The attraction was based on multiple factors: novelty, physical appearance, behavioral differences, and the perception that association with Australian soldiers provided some form of benefit or protection. Military observers recognized that the Saigon effect represented something significant about how people perceive and interact with military personnel. The effect demonstrated that physical attractiveness and interpersonal skill could be as important as military capability in determining how a military force was perceived by local populations. This understanding was not incorporated into official military doctrine. The American military did not respond to the Saigon effect by attempting to improve the physical fitness of American soldiers or by providing training on interpersonal interaction with foreign populations. The phenomenon was largely treated as a curiosity, rather than as something with broader military implications. But military sociologists and military strategists recognized that the Saigon effect represented an aspect of military effectiveness that was rarely discussed in military leadership circles. The ability to interact effectively with local populations, to be perceived favorably by those populations, to build relationships of trust and cooperation. These were aspects of military effectiveness that were difficult to quantify, but that had real consequences. By 1970, as the Australian military presence in Vietnam was ending, the Saigon effect began to fade from visibility. Australian soldiers were rotating out of Vietnam. The opportunities for Vietnamese women to encounter Australian soldiers were decreasing, but the phenomenon had left its mark. Vietnamese women who had encountered Australian soldiers would remember those encounters. The reputation of Australian soldiers as being physically attractive and respectful in interpersonal interaction persisted. Years later, when researchers interviewed Vietnamese women who had been in Saigon during the war, many recalled the phenomenon of Australian soldiers. They remembered being attracted to Australian soldiers. They remembered approaching Australian soldiers. They remembered the way Australian soldiers had treated them with respect and interest. One Vietnamese woman named Thuy, interviewed in 1995, remembered her encounters with Australian soldiers decades earlier. "I was young," she said. "There was war everywhere. When I saw Australian soldiers, they seemed different from American soldiers. They seemed more human. They looked at you like you were a person, not just part of the landscape. That was attractive. That made me want to talk to them." This memory, shared by Thuy and by many other Vietnamese women, reflected something important about the Saigon effect. It was not primarily about physical appearance, although appearance mattered. It was primarily about how Australian soldiers engaged with Vietnamese civilians as human beings, rather than as part of a military situation. American soldiers were conducting military operations in Vietnam. Vietnamese civilians were part of the environment where those military operations were conducted. The interaction was framed in terms of military necessity rather than in terms of genuine human connection. Australian soldiers were also conducting military operations in Vietnam. But Australian soldiers seemed to approach interaction with Vietnamese civilians differently. Australian soldiers seemed to see Vietnamese civilians as people rather than as part of the operational environment. This difference in approach, combined with the physical attractiveness advantage that Australian soldiers possessed, created the Saigon effect. By the year 2000, as Vietnam moved further into the past, the Saigon effect had become something of a historical footnote. It was mentioned in some accounts of the Vietnam War. It was discussed in some sociological studies of military-civilian interaction, but it was not treated as a significant military phenomenon. But the phenomenon had represented something important. It had demonstrated that military effectiveness was not simply a matter of firepower and resources. It was also a matter of how military personnel interacted with local populations and how those populations perceived military personnel. The slouch hat and the boots represented Australian tactical and physical adaptation. The Saigon effect represented something different. It represented the way that physical attractiveness and respectful interpersonal engagement could create attraction and influence across cultural boundaries.
These were different types of influence, but both types of influence contributed to the broader pattern of Australian impact on Vietnam and on the American military presence in Vietnam. The phenomenon of Vietnamese women being attracted to Australian soldiers was not intentional or planned. It was not the result of strategic decision-making by Australian military leadership. It was simply the natural result of Australian soldiers being visible in Saigon, being physically attractive compared to American soldiers, and approaching interaction with Vietnamese civilians in ways that Vietnamese women found respectful and engaging. But the phenomenon had consequences. It influenced how Vietnamese civilians perceived Australian soldiers. It influenced how Vietnamese women viewed the difference between Australian and American soldiers. It contributed to a broader understanding that military effectiveness was not simply a matter of military capability, but also a matter of interpersonal effectiveness and how a military force was perceived by the population it was operating among. Dr. Samuel Richardson, the sociologist who had studied the Saigon effect, published his findings in a military journal in 1969. Richardson's conclusion was that the Saigon effect demonstrated the importance of training military personnel in cultural competence and interpersonal effectiveness.
Military effectiveness in counterinsurgency environments is not solely determined by firepower and military capability, Richardson wrote. It is also determined by how military personnel interact with local populations and how those populations perceive military personnel. The Australian military appears to have developed an approach to such interaction that is more effective than the American approach. If the American military is to improve its effectiveness in similar environments, it must consider not just military tactics, but also how military personnel approach interpersonal interaction with foreign populations. Richardson's recommendation was not broadly adopted. The American military continued to emphasize firepower and military capability, rather than emphasizing cultural competence and interpersonal effectiveness. But Richardson's study documented an important phenomenon and pointed toward implications that the American military did not fully grasp or accept. The Saigon effect faded from visibility as the American and Australian presence in Vietnam faded. But the phenomenon had demonstrated something that military strategists and sociologists recognized. The way military personnel interacted with local populations mattered. The way military personnel were perceived by local populations mattered. These aspects of military effectiveness were not easily quantified or measured, but they had real consequences. By the year 2010, more than 40 years after the Australian military had departed Vietnam, the Saigon effect existed primarily in the memories of those who had experienced it. Vietnamese women who had been young in 1967 and 1968 remembered being attracted to Australian soldiers. Australian soldiers remembered encountering Vietnamese women who were attracted to them. But the broader lesson about military effectiveness and interpersonal engagement had not been fully absorbed into military doctrine or military training. The slouch hat and the boots had become symbols of Australian military adaptation and had influenced how the American military approached tactical operations and physical training. The Saigon effect had demonstrated something about military effectiveness that was more difficult to quantify and more difficult to incorporate into military doctrine. But the Saigon effect had been real. It had influenced how Vietnamese civilians perceived military personnel. It had demonstrated that physical attractiveness and respectful interpersonal engagement could create influence and attraction across military and cultural boundaries. That lesson persisted, even if it was not explicitly acknowledged in military circles. The lesson was that military effectiveness was not simply about military capability. It was also about how military personnel interacted with the populations they were operating among, and how those populations perceived military personnel.